False flags are covert operations usually conducted by governments or corporations, which are made to appear as though performed by another entity. For instance, when Israel attacked the USS Liberty in order to blame on Egypt, or when the USS Maine was blown up to blame on Cuba and Spain. False flags are used disturbingly often and effectively through the implementation of the Hegelian dialectic. H. L. Mencken wrote, "The whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed and hence clamorous to be led to safety by menacing it with an endless series of hobgoblins, all of them imaginary." One of the methods used by the elite to incrementally implement their New World Order agenda is known as problem-reaction-solution, or the Hegelian dialectic, from the German philosopher. Paul Joseph Watson wrote, "Hegel proposed that all spiritual, intellectual, and historical development, whether negative or positive, progressed from the outcome of two opposing ideals. Thesis clashed with antithesis, and this produced synthesis. The modern-day application of the dialectic is used by the ruling elite to create mass groupthink that enables them to further their agenda without opposition. In its simplest form, it's brainwashing. In the past, the dialectic has been used to manufacture war. Both the Bolsheviks and the Nazis were funded and supported by the elite. These two forces were then made to clash in order to foment the chaos of World War II. The widely used term amongst researchers today is problem-reaction-solution, and the tactic is mainly used to oppress populations, advance the police state, and further the geopolitical aims of the New World Order. First, a problem is created and designed to elicit a certain reaction out of the public. Then, the people demand something be done about the problem, and willingly accept the pre-planned New World Order solution, a solution that always involves actions or legislation that never would have passed under normal circumstances. It works like this. The manipulating body covertly creates a problem and then directs the media to incessantly focus on it without recourse. Remember, you only need to control the top of the pyramid. Most media coverage is an exercise in regurgitating what the big newspapers and TV stations are reporting. The problem could be anything: a war, a financial collapse, a rash of child abductions, or a terrorist attack. The power of the media can create the false perception that a big problem exists, even if it doesn't. Once you've created this problem, you make sure that an individual, a group, or an aspect of society is blamed. This then rallies the population behind the desperate lunge for a solution to the problem. "Something must be done," they cry in unison. The people that created the problem in the first place then come back in and offer the solution that the people demand. Remember, the people screaming for a solution do not know that the problem was artificially created in the first place. The solution to the problem is always a further curtailment of freedom and an advancement of one or more aspects of the New World Order agenda, whether that's geopolitical expansion, new laws, or the implementation of new societal worldviews. The Hegelian dialectic of problem-reaction-solution. Attack yourself, blame your enemies, and tell the public you can protect them if they give up their freedoms. World War I officially began on June 28, 1914, when members of the Illuminati Black Hand secret society assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Europe quickly polarized and warred for nearly a year before Americans were given their false flag reason to join. On May 1, 1915, the British naval cruiser Lusitania was scheduled for Liverpool, taking off from New York Harbor, loaded with 600 tons of explosives, 6 million pounds of ammunition, 1,248 cases of shrapnel shells, other war materials, and last but not least, American passengers. The German embassy in D.C. was fully aware of the war materials being shipped into England on the Lusitania, and tried to warn the American travelers. German embassy officials attempted to place full-page ads in 50 U.S. newspapers reading, "Notice, travelers intending to embark on the Atlantic voyage are reminded that a state of war exists between Germany and her allies and Great Britain and her allies."
Travelers sailing in the war zone on ships of Great Britain do so at their own risk. Due to actions taken by the U.S. State Department, 49 of those 50 newspapers never ran the ad. Gary Allen wrote, "The same crowd which manipulated the passage of the income tax and the Federal Reserve System wanted America in the war. J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, Colonel House, Jacob Schiff, Paul Warburg, and the rest of the Jekyll Island conspirators were all deeply involved in getting us involved. Many of these financiers had loaned England large sums of money. In fact, J.P. Morgan and Company served as British financial agents in this country during World War I. The German government took out large ads in all the New York papers, warning potential passengers that the ship was carrying munitions and telling them not to cross the Atlantic on it. Yet the sinking of the Lusitania was used by clever propagandists to portray the Germans as inhuman slaughterers of innocents. Submarine warfare was manufactured into a cause célèbre to push us into war. Midday, May 7th, off the coast of Ireland, the Lusitania was ordered to reduce speed, and Juno, its British military escort vessel, was ordered to withdraw. Committee of 300, 33rd degree Freemason, and Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, knew German U-boats were in the vicinity and purposely called off Juno, leaving the Lusitania a sitting duck. Jim Mars wrote, "British Commander Joseph Kenworthy, on duty when the ship was sunk, later revealed that her military escort was withdrawn at the last minute, and her captain ordered to enter at reduced speed an area where a German U-boat was known to be operating. It is clear why Germany attacked this ship, and Britain would have done the same if U.S. munitions were being shipped to Germany. The Germans, whose torpedo struck the liner, were the unwitting accomplices, or victims, of a plot probably concocted by Winston Churchill." Fritz Springmeier wrote, "The Lusitania was a ploy. It was packed with some Morgan-owned ammunition, had been given over to England as a member of the Navy, and despite the warnings of the Germans, was sent into a naval war zone, specifically to be a target, the catalyst for America's entrance into the war. Churchill ordered the Lusitania's naval escort to return to port, and the fated ship was left unprotected to be sunk. Rothschild agent Colonel House probably knew of this plot. Records point to a discussion of it between him and Sir Edward Grey of England. Historian Colin Simpson called the sinking of the Lusitania, quote, "the foulest act of willful murder ever committed on the seas." Churchill's fellow Committee of 300 member, CFR founder, and Rothschild agent Colonel Mandell House was also President Wilson's top political advisor. Wilson said, "Mr. House is my second personality. He is my independent self. His thoughts and mine are one. If I were in his place, I would just do as he suggested." This is a man who has also been called the Henry Kissinger of his day. In the book The Intimate Papers of Colonel House is a conversation recorded between Colonel House and the Foreign Secretary of England, Sir Edward Grey. Grey asked, "What will America do if the Germans sink an ocean liner with American passengers on board?" And House answered, "I believe that a flame of indignation would sweep the United States, and that by itself would be sufficient to carry us into the war." Just as luck would have it, that is exactly what happened. Around 1,200 were killed, including 128 Americans. This act set off a firestorm of anti-German feeling throughout the United States, fanned by the Rockefeller-Morgan-dominated press. So Illuminati Morgan-owned ammunition was loaded on a ship with American passengers. Committee of 300 and 33rd degree Mason Winston Churchill ordered off the ship's military escort, knowing German U-boats were standing by. Then the Rockefeller-Morgan-dominated U.S. press helped stir anti-German sentiment until the people were sufficiently propagandized to enter the war. President Woodrow Wilson, like Winston Churchill, the Morgans and Rockefellers, knew of the Lusitania's pre-planned fate, and he knew the decision to sink it was out of his hands. Colin Simpson wrote, "There can be no doubt that President Wilson was told of the character of the cargo destined for the Lusitania. He did nothing, but was to concede on the day he was told of her sinking that his foreknowledge had given him many sleepless hours. Gary Allen wrote, "Woodrow Wilson was re-elected by a hair. He had based his campaign on the slogan, 'He kept us out of war.' Just 5 months later, we were in it. The same crowd which manipulated the passage of the income tax and the Federal Reserve System wanted America in the war. J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, Colonel House, Jacob Schiff, Paul Warburg, and the rest of the Jekyll Island conspirators were all deeply involved. World War I was a financial bonanza for the international bankers, but it was a catastrophe of such magnitude for the United States that few even today grasp its importance. The war reversed our traditional foreign policy of non-involvement, and we have been enmeshed almost constantly ever since in perpetual wars for perpetual peace. Winston Churchill once observed that all nations would have been better off had the U.S. minded its own business. Had we done so, he said, quote, "Peace would have been made with Germany, and there would have been no collapse in Russia leading to communism, no breakdown of government in Italy followed by fascism, and Nazism never would have gained ascendancy in Germany." Though it goes unmentioned in America's government-issue school textbooks, documents and recordings have been declassified and released through Freedom of Information Act requests, proving that America's entry into World War II was another calculated event, and not the result of a surprise Japanese attack. A 1940 Gallup poll showed 83% of the public was against intervention. A good pretext was needed to gain support from an intransigent public. 32nd President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a 33rd degree Mason, Committee of 300 member, grandson of an opium smuggler, and nephew of Frederick Delano, an original Federal Reserve boardman. FDR stayed in office for 12 years, 1933 to 1945, choosing skull and bonesman Henry Stimson as Secretary of War for the last 5 years. Henry Stimson was also Secretary of War to his brother bonesman, President Taft, from 1911 to 1913 during the build-up to World War I. With the aid of fellow Mason and Committee of 300 member, Britain's Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, these three secret society elites would help lead us into World War II. David Icke wrote, "Roosevelt, an Illuminati bloodline wholly owned by the Council on Foreign Relations, set about provoking Japan into an attack with a number of measures, including the targeting of Japanese oil supplies. As a congressional investigation heard in 1945, the messages indicating a decision to go to war with the United States and Britain, though not with Russia, were intercepted and decoded on December 3, 1941, 4 days before Pearl Harbor. These messages subsequently went missing from Navy files. Other decoded messages gave Roosevelt prior warning of the attack, but the public were not told, and nor were the sitting targets in Hawaii. In all, Roosevelt had information from 8 different sources indicating a probable attack. The historian Robert Stinnett revealed the results of 17 years of research into the Pearl Harbor conspiracy in his book Day of Deceit: The Truth About FDR and Pearl Harbor. His research included more than 1 million documents obtained under the Freedom of Information Act, which show that knowledge of the Japanese plans was kept from commanders in Hawaii, the very same men who were later made scapegoats for what happened. One very early warning came almost a full year before the attack, on January 27, 1941. Joseph Grew, the U.S. ambassador to Tokyo, wrote a letter to Roosevelt stating specifically that in the event of war, Pearl Harbor would be Japan's first target. Months later, on July 22, 1941, a report by Admiral Richmond Turner read, quote, "It is generally believed that shutting off the American supply of petroleum will lead promptly to the invasion of Netherland East Indies. It seems certain that she, Japan, would also include military action in the Philippine Islands, which would immediately involve us in a Pacific War." This is precisely what would happen. Alex Jones wrote, "Months before the attack,
They knew the Japanese were preparing for an all-out assault in the Pacific. The History Channel and many historical records have reported that 12 days prior to the attack, Roosevelt knew the actual date of the strike. The government had in its possession Admiral Yamamoto's communique reading, quote, "On the morning of December 7, we will attack the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor and deal a death blow." 2 weeks before the Pearl Harbor attack, on November 25, 1941, after a conversation with Secretary of War Henry Stimson, Roosevelt wrote in his diary, quote, "The question was how we should maneuver them into the position of firing the first shot without too much danger to ourselves. It was desirable to make sure the Japanese be the ones to do this, so that there should remain no doubt in anyone's mind as to who were the aggressors." On November 26th, the day after Roosevelt's diary entry, he received a very suspicious phone call from Winston Churchill. A large Japanese fleet, including 6 aircraft carriers, had recently gone missing, and Churchill said to Roosevelt in the recording, quote, "I can assure you that their goal is the fleet in Hawaii at Pearl Harbor." Roosevelt goes on to ask, quote, "The obvious implication is that the Japs are going to do a Port Arthur on us at Pearl Harbor. Do you concur?" Churchill says he does indeed, and Roosevelt adds, quote, "I will have to consider the entire problem. A Japanese attack on us, which would result in war between, and certainly you as well, would certainly fulfill 2 of the most important requirements of our policy." Exactly what requirements and what policy Roosevelt was referring to is unknown, but one thinks back to fellow 33rd degree Mason Albert Pike's 1871 letter to Mazzini about fomenting 3 world wars. It was also Churchill's fellow Committee of 300 member and Mason H.G. Wells who predicted, in his 1933 book The Shape of Things to Come, that a Second World War would start around 1940, originating from a German-Polish dispute. Were Albert Pike, H.G. Wells, and other Masons prophetic in their visions of the future, or were they knowingly, actively working towards a long-planned objective? Jim Marrs wrote, "As hard to believe as it may be for Americans brought up on wartime propaganda films and publications devoted merely to war technology and battles, World War II was largely the result of infighting between secret occult societies composed of wealthy businessmen that eventually led to international tensions that provoked open warfare. As in other conflicts, the manipulation and influence of these societies is found in the origins and finances of the war, not on the battlefields. Abundant evidence now exists indicating that World War II was brought about by agents and members of secret societies connected to the Illuminati and Freemasonry in both Germany and Britain. The day after the Roosevelt-Churchill phone call, on November 27, 1941, news of the Japanese fleet's probable approach on Pearl Harbor reached CFR-connected U.S. Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall. On the same day, he sent a message to Hawaiian commanders stating, quote, "Hostile action possible at any moment. If hostilities cannot be avoided, the United States desires that Japan commit the first overt act. This policy should not be construed as restricting you to a course of action that might jeopardize your defense." The Honolulu Advertiser front page headline on November 30th, 1941 read, "Japan may strike over weekend." Still, the military was told to go to the lowest level of readiness. The ships in the harbor were lined up in tight rows, and the aircraft on the airfields were put into circles, nose-tip to nose-tip. During the week before the attack, the U.S. intercepted a Code Purple message sent to the Japanese embassy in Washington, ordering them to destroy all classified documents and prepare to evacuate the country. On December 4th, Australian intelligence reported to Roosevelt that the missing Japanese fleet was indeed moving toward Pearl Harbor. That same day, Roosevelt specifically ordered the Pacific Fleet moved into a compact and exposed formation of snug rows. Pearl Harbor Admiral James Richardson repeatedly objected to such strategic suicide and was actually replaced for refusing to position the fleet as ordered. Not only was the Pearl Harbor fleet intentionally lined up nose-tip to nose-tip for Japan's carpet-bombing convenience, but all the brand-new U.S. ships and aircraft were moved away, leaving only the older ships to be sacrificed. Jim Marrs wrote, according to author John Tolland, separate warnings regarding a pending attack on Pearl Harbor, though varying as to a specific time, came from U.S. Ambassador to Japan Joseph Crew, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, Senator Guy Gillette, Congressman Martin Dees, Brigadier General Elliot Thorpe in Java, and Colonel F.G.I. Weigerman, the Dutch military attaché in Washington. Later, Dutch naval officer Captain Johan Ranette said sources in U.S. intelligence told him on December 6th that the Japanese carriers were only 400 miles northwest of Hawaii. During investigations after the attack, Marshal and Navy Secretary Frank Knox both testified that they could not recall their whereabouts the night of December 6th. It was later revealed that they were both in the White House with Roosevelt. 4 years later, another 33rd degree Mason, Harry Truman, still under the direction of Bonesman's Secretary of War Henry Stimson, dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan, ending World War II. In fact, Japan was waving their white flag and had already surrendered to the US's terms and conditions before the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But in order to make an example out of Japan, and to show the world US weaponry and military dominance, Truman did not honor the surrender until after the bombs were dropped. David Icke wrote, "This is the background to Harry S. Truman, the Freemason placeman who refused to accept Japan's terms of surrender, ordered the atomic devastation, and then accepted the surrender on the same terms he had refused before. The bombs were dropped because as one phase ended, another was immediately begun, the Cold War. And it is so much easier to engender the fear necessary for that if people have seen for themselves what happens when one of these devices explodes. After the war, the world was mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and physically devastated. This allowed the banks to make vast fortunes lending money to governments to rebuild the societies destroyed by a war the same banks had funded. This massively increased the debt owed by nations to private banks, and the control over those countries increased in proportion. The desperation for peace made the world open to the main reason the Brotherhood had created the war, the formation of the United Nations. Problem, reaction, solution. The charter for the United Nations, the worldwide body the Brotherhood so badly wanted, was written by a committee of the Council on Foreign Relations. Tex Marrs wrote, "The best of historians now admit, for example, that President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his corrupt Masonic associates knew in advance of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor that catapulted the United States into war. The Illuminati wanted World War, and the American airmen, soldiers, and sailors who died on December 7, 1941, were considered necessary to precipitate the USA's entrance into World War II. The U.S. government also had prior knowledge of both the 1993 Oklahoma City bombing of the Murrah Federal Building and the 9/11 bombing attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon. The massive loss of life was no obstacle as far as the elite were concerned. Their cold-blooded agenda is calculated to engender chaos and destruction in a never-ending alchemical process of bringing ordo ab chao, order out of chaos. To the elite, murder is business as usual." On August 2, 1964, the USS Maddox destroyer was supposedly conducting reconnaissance in the Gulf of Tonkin when fired upon by North Vietnamese forces in Swatah gunboats. The Maddox, however, was not on a reconnaissance mission. It was part of a joint CIA South Vietnamese covert intelligence operation called Operation Plan 34A. Paul Joseph Watson wrote, "Far from being an unprovoked attack, as President Lyndon Johnson had stated, the attack was an expected retaliation as a result of aggressive CIA South Vietnamese maneuvers. Johnson himself acknowledged Operation Plan 34A in recently released White House tape recordings. Quote, "There have been some covert operations in that Tonkin Gulf area that we have been carrying on, blowing up some bridges and things of that kind, roads and so forth, so I imagine the North Vietnamese wanted to put a stop to it." Once again, the people were manipulated into believing a false flag reason for entering the Vietnam War. This time, the public was told a friendly ship came under unprovoked enemy attack, when in fact, our ship was the aggressor. From the Terror Storm DVD, in the summer of 1964, President Lyndon Baines Johnson needed a pretext to commit the American people to the already expanding covert war in Southeast Asia. In November of 2001, the LBJ Presidential Library and Museum released tapes of phone conversations with the President and then Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, where they openly discussed plans to use the staged Gulf of Tonkin incident as a pretext to expand the war. In late 2005, the National Security Agency declassified its own official history of the Gulf of Tonkin and admitted that the intelligence agency officers had deliberately skewed the intelligence and claimed that Vietnamese patrol boats had attacked U.S. destroyers on August 4, 1964, when in reality they had done nothing, even while being fired on by U.S. forces. On August 4, 1964, the U.S. destroyers received radar and radio signals that were misinterpreted as being another enemy attack from the North Vietnamese Navy. Supposedly a 2-hour shootout ensued, but in reality there were likely no enemy ships out there. An hour after the incident, Captain John J. Herrick of the USS Maddox sent a cable admitting the attack may not have been an attack after all. Captain John J. Herrick said on August 4, 1964, quote, "Review of action makes many reported contacts and torpedoes fired appear doubtful. Freak weather effects on radar and overeager sonar men may have accounted for many reports. No actual visual sightings by Maddox. Suggest complete evaluation before any further action taken." Naval aviator James Stockdale said, "I had the best seat in the house to watch that event, and our destroyers were just shooting at phantom targets. There were no PT boats out there. There was nothing but black water and American firepower." With no justification whatsoever, on the evening of August 4th, Johnson stated, "The initial attack on the destroyer Maddox on August 2nd was repeated today by a number of hostile vessels." Actually, no U.S. ships were fired upon, and there were likely no Vietnamese boats present either, but Johnson reported, quote, "We believe at least 2 of the attacking boats were sunk." Later on, however, in 1965, Johnson was quoted referring to the Tonkin incident, admitting, quote, "For all I know, our Navy was shooting at whales out there." Paul Joseph Watson wrote, "The Vietnam War killed 1 million Vietnamese and 58,000 Americans. It was launched after 2 incidents in August 1964, the first of which was provoked, and the second never happened. With careful avoidance of the facts, then President Lyndon Baines Johnson was able to ram through the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, denouncing those who raised suspicious voices as anti-American and receiving a validation for war." The recently declassified Operation Northwoods documents, kept top secret for 40 years, outline a U.S. government plot to kill hundreds, probably thousands, of American citizens for political gain. In 1962, President JFK's Joint Chief of Staff, General L.L. Lemnitzer, masterminded the Northwoods Plan in order to start a war with Cuba. The American people certainly did not want a war, and neither did Castro, so a series of false flag operations were designed to cause a, quote, "helpful wave of indignation," and get people behind a war. The methods to be employed were many and varied, from starting rumors using clandestine radio, to sinking and setting fires to U.S. ships, dressing like Cubans to attack U.S. bases, blowing up ammunition and planes, starting fires and riots, and last but not least, hijacking and shooting down a commercial passenger plane. The document actually says that, quote, casualty lists in U.S. newspapers would cause a helpful wave of indignation. They even plan to, quote, conduct funerals for mock victims, to gain added public support if there weren't enough real victims. All this was already approved and signed by every Joint Chief of Staff and the Secretary of Defense when President John F. Kennedy received it. Thankfully for us all, JFK refused to sign the Northwoods document, and the plan was never carried out, but its very existence proves that the government is certainly not always friendly and looking out for our best interests. Paul Joseph Watson wrote, "It has been officially revealed via declassified government documents that the U.S. military and government has covertly planned to perpetrate acts of terror upon innocent civilians in order to justify an engagement in conflict that would have, at the time, benefited the government's wider geopolitical agenda." According to ABC News, in the early 1960s, America's top military leaders reportedly drafted plans to kill innocent people and commit acts of terrorism in U.S. cities to create public support for a war against Cuba. Long-hidden documents uncovered in 2001 by former ABC News investigative reporter James Bamford, codenamed Operation Northwoods, put a haunting perspective behind the events of September 11th. The Joint Chiefs of Staff documents propose launching a secret and violent war of terrorism against their own country in order to condition the people of the USA into supporting an intended war against Cuba. These sickening plans called for innocent American civilians to be shot, for Cuban refugees to be blown up, for violent and continued acts of terrorism to be perpetrated in major American cities, for innocents to be framed for bombings, and for planes to be hijacked. This would then be blamed on Fidel Castro and Cuba, thus inciting hatred for him and communism and instigating the public backing that the JCS needed as an excuse to launch the pre-planned war. James Bamford wrote, "The plan, which had the written approval of the chairman and every member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, called for innocent people to be shot on American streets, for boats carrying refugees fleeing Cuba to be sunk on the high seas, for a wave of violent terrorism to be launched in Washington, D.C., Miami, and elsewhere. People would be framed for bombings they did not commit. Planes would be hijacked. Using phony evidence, all of it would be blamed on Castro, thus giving Lemnitzer and his cabal the excuse, as well as the public and international backing they need to launch their war." David Icke wrote, "It is no good people claiming their leaders could not have been behind the horrors of 9/11 when the documents exist to show that the Pentagon had planned in detail something very similar 40 years ago. And wait for this, Operation Northwoods also planned the hijacking of civil aircraft. The documents say it was possible to create an incident that would convince the people that the Cuban aircraft had shot down a chartered civil airliner on a flight from the United States to Jamaica, Guatemala, Venezuela, or Panama. In the Northwoods document, it actually refers to the USS Maine false flag pretext to the Spanish-American War. It reads, quote, "A Remember the Maine incident could be arranged in several forms. We could blow up a ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame Cuba, or we could blow up a drone anywhere in Cuban waters. So Northwoods ordered to sink our own ships, like the USS Maine, ordered to hijack and shoot down our own commercial airliners, like 9/11, and to bomb ourselves, like World Trade Center 93, Oklahoma, Madrid, 7/7, and so many others." The April 19, 1995 Oklahoma City bombing of the MERI Federal Building resulted in over 800 injuries and 168 lost lives. Though overwhelming evidence disputes their claims, the government and mainstream media quickly agreed that the bombing was perpetrated by a terrorist named Timothy McVeigh. Allegedly, McVeigh acted alone and parked a single Ryder truck bomb affront the MERI building on that morning. However, 20 eyewitnesses reported seeing two men. David Icke wrote, 20 eyewitnesses saw two men in a Ryder truck. Each one described the second man as Middle Eastern and said it absolutely was not Terry Nichols, the patsy John Doe 2 agents tried to blame. All 20 people filled out 302s, investigative reports, but none have ever surfaced. Also, just like 9/11, the Pentagon's 80 CCTVs and the London bombings in the Tube, the 12 camera tapes at the MERI building were seized and withheld, all for reasons of national security. The 20 witnesses' reports were ignored, and the security tapes were withheld. When forced by investigators to find a second patsy, officials came up with Terry Nichols, who they claimed to be McVeigh's accomplice, even though all eyewitnesses agreed the second man in the truck was Middle Eastern, and definitely not Terry Nichols. David Icke wrote, McVeigh was arrested so conveniently for a traffic offense immediately after the bombing for the same reason that Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested in a cinema immediately after the Kennedy assassination, and Osama bin Laden was named as the culprit after 9/11. They are the patsies required by problem-reaction solution to hide the real orchestrators. Just as 9/11 was a massive version of what happened in Oklahoma, so Oklahoma was a repeat of the Kennedy assassination. Lee Harvey Oswald was a U.S. agent who was placed in the right place at the right time without being told exactly why he was there. He realized this after Kennedy was shot and ran. When he was arrested, he said he was a patsy, a stooge, and would have said so in court. That's why he was paraded in public to allow another government agent, Jack Ruby, to shoot him and kill the evidence. In the same way, very possibly, McVeigh was a government stooge who parked the Ryder truck without knowing the full story. On the morning of April 19th, shortly after the bombing, in live broadcasts, CBS, CNN, and NBC all reported on 3 additional bombs inside the building. One of the bombs exploded, and 2 others were found and defused. Oklahoma City's NBC affiliate, KFOR, in their live feed, immediately reported, quote, "The first bomb that was in the federal building did go off. It did the damage that you see right there. The second explosive was found and defused. The third explosive that was found, and they are working on right now as we speak, I understand, both the second and third explosives, if you can imagine this, were larger than the first. So try to imagine 2- or 3-fold happening what we've already seen there. It is just incredible to think that there was that much heavy artillery that was somehow moved into the downtown Oklahoma City Federal Building." Once Timothy McVeigh was arrested, all reports of the additional bombs inside the building ceased. The mainstream media quickly parroted the government line, and America was assured that the perpetrators, McVeigh and Nichols, acted alone using a single truck bomb. This, however, has been disproved repeatedly. Out of hundreds of people interviewed, we couldn't find a single person who said they'd only heard one explosion. The University of Oklahoma's own seismographic reports, as well as the U.S. Geological Survey reports, 2 different scientific institutions, show multiple explosions. But for there to have been multiple explosions, Timothy McVeigh would have had to have accomplices, and that didn't fit in with the federal story. Especially if the reality showed that it had to be a group that had access to the federal building for long, extended periods of time, like the BATF and the FBI. Even the U.S. Air Force's own 1997 blast effect study of the Oklahoma City bombing verified the impossibility of being the result of a single bomb. General Benton K. Parton concluded that, quote, "It is impossible to ascribe the damage that occurred on April 19, 1995 to a single truck bomb containing 4,800 pounds. In fact, the maximum predicted damage of the floor panels of the MERI Federal Building is equal to approximately 1% of the total floor area of the building. It must be concluded that the damage at the MERI Federal Building is not the result of the truck bomb itself, but rather due to other factors, such as locally placed charges within the building itself. In the report, General Parton also mentions how a single bomb cannot explain the failure of many columns in the back of the building, as compared to the non-failure of columns in the front where the truck was parked. Parton concluded that shaped demolition charges were indeed used inside the building. The blast effect study showed that the maximum damage possible from a single truck bomb would affect only 1% of the floor area. Take a look at any photo of the MERI building after the explosions. To ascribe the amount of actual damage done to merely this is ludicrous. David Icke wrote, Glenn and Kathy Wilburn, who lost 2 small children in the bombing, worked constantly and passionately for years to uncover the truth of what happened. They conducted and documented more than 300 hours of interviews, and persuaded people to talk who had remained silent for fear of the consequences. They established beyond question that a heavily armed bomb squad had been in downtown Oklahoma near the MERI building that morning before the bombs exploded. Some parents saw these people in their bomb squad uniforms as they dropped off their children at the daycare center in the MERI building, children they would never see alive again. Eventually, after months of denial by the FBI and other government agencies, the sheriff's department had to admit that the bomb squad had been there. After months of meticulous, independent investigation, Glenn and Kathy Wilburn got the sheriff's department to actually admit what they already knew from multiple, consistent eyewitness testimonies. A government bomb squad had been at the MERI Federal Building that very morning. Emergency radio transmission transcripts from that morning also prove that many policemen and firefighters witnessed BATF at the scene. Oklahoma lawyer Daniel J. Atomatis was interviewed saying, "There was this fairly large truck with a trailer behind it. It had a shield on the side of the door that said bomb disposal or bomb squad below it, and I really found that interesting. You know, I'd never seen anything like that in person." Alex Jones said, "Do you realize what you've just read? The government had multiple surveillance cameras. The cameras also show the BATF agents hiding out right down the street, preparing to pounce on the operation and declare themselves the heroes, the saviors. From A to Z, there are federal fingerprints all over the Oklahoma City bombing, and the government is doing everything it can to suppress the truth. Bill Clinton is the servant of the New World Order, whose approval rating exploded after the attack. His attack dog, the butcher of Waco, Janet Reno, was very happy to blame everything on Christians, conservatives, and gun owners. It was her excuse to expand federal control over local police and to merge the military with the police in new, giant anti-terrorism training programs." David Icke wrote, "The U.S. government hired the same company to carry away the remains of the Oklahoma City bombing and the World Trade Center. The company is ironically named Controlled Demolitions." And Paul Joseph Watson wrote, "The handling of the World Trade Center rubble almost mirrors that of the Oklahoma City Alfred P. Murrah building. After eyewitnesses reported several explosions and original newscasts detailed the recovery of second and third explosive devices, the government declared that there was just one bomb, and the remains of the building were professionally demolished by Controlled Demolitions, Inc., the same company that was first on the scene to cart away the World Trade Center rubble. Debris of the federal building was then carted off to a private landfill and guarded 24 hours a day by Wackenhut private security. Nothing to hide there then, hey? The FEMA team that investigated why the towers collapsed was headed by Dr. W. Gene Corley, the same individual the government called upon to whitewash the Waco fire inquiry and the Oklahoma City bombing. Another strange coincidence to note is that just 2 years earlier, in 1993, Martin Keating, the brother of Oklahoma's governor Frank Keating, wrote a novel called The Final Jihad. In his book, a man named Tom McVeigh bombs an Oklahoma City federal building. Linda Kavanaugh from NBC's Oklahoma affiliate KFOR even reported on this oddity, saying, "The news channel has learned of another strange development. Apparently, before the bombing, Governor Frank Keating's brother, Martin, had been working on a novel about a terrorist bombing in Oklahoma City. Stranger still, one of the characters in the novel was named Thomas McVeigh." Also adding to the mystery, Martin Keating dedicated his book to an unknown group called the Knights of the Secret Circle. The official story of what happened on 9/11, backed by both the Bush administration and the Keane Commission's investigation, is as follows. On September 11, 2001, 19 al-Qaeda terrorists under the direction of Osama bin Laden hijacked 4 commercial airliners, flew 2 into the World Trade Center towers, 1 into the Pentagon, and crashed the last in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, after a passenger revolt on board. The 2 Trade Center towers burned for 56 and 103 minutes respectively, before collapsing symmetrically at near free-fall speed into their own footprint. Another building, not hit by a plane, the 47-story World Trade Center 7 building, also collapsed at free-fall speed many hours later, allegedly due to internal fires and structural damage from falling debris. While on the surface, this explanation for the 9/11 events may seem plausible, it does not stand up to critical scrutiny. To begin with, if the official story is true, World Trade Center Buildings 1, 2, and 7 all made history on 9/11 by being the first and only steel-framed buildings ever to collapse from fire or a plane crash. Steel-framed buildings have burned for up to 28 hours, gutting the entire interiors, but still not collapsed. The Empire State Building was hit by a B-25 and never collapsed. Hundreds of architects and engineers at AE911truth.org and World Trade Center designer and architect Minoru Yamasaki himself have expressed repeatedly that the World Trade Center buildings were specifically built to withstand an airplane collision of that magnitude. There even used to be an information sign at the top assuring visitors of just that. And since the buildings stood strong for a good hour after impact, it's safe to say the collapses were not caused by the plane crashes. The official story states that fires from burning jet fuel weakened the building's steel beams until they gave way and collapsed. In the past, all over the world, steel buildings have burned uncontrollably for over 20 hours, completely decimating every floor and still not collapsed. Not once in history had one fallen from fire until 9/11, when World Trade Center Buildings 1, 2, and 7 supposedly all did. The National Institute for Standards and Technology, NIST, reports that the temperatures of jet fuel fires do not exceed 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, and steel does not begin to melt until 2800 degrees. This means they would have us believe jet fuel fires burning 1000 degrees below steel's melting point for only 56 and 103 minutes on only 8 and 5 floors respectively was enough to bring down the Twin Towers. Even giving them the benefit of the doubt, assuming that jet fuel fires did somehow weaken the steel frames enough to bring down the buildings, how is it possible that they collapsed at near free-fall speed? The official story is that fire-induced structural failure caused each floor to collapse and pancake on top of one another. In order for a floor to fall, hundreds of joints had to break almost simultaneously on 236 exterior columns and 47 core columns. For a 1,300-foot building, 10 seconds is almost free-fall speed. But if each floor produced just a little resistance, so that breaking through each one took a half a second, the collapse of all those floors, 80 or 95 of them, would have taken 40 to 47 seconds. Can we really believe that the upper part of the buildings encountered virtually no resistance from the lower parts? The problem would be even worse in relation to the North Tower, at least if Hufschmidt is right to say that it fell in 8 seconds, which would be exactly free-fall speed. How, he asks, could the debris crush 100 steel and concrete floors while falling as fast as objects fall through air? News footage, Firefighters, Ground Zero workers, and other witnesses reported molten metal flowing out of windows preceding the collapse, and huge pools collected in the basement area remaining in molten form for over 5 weeks. For fire to produce molten steel, it absolutely must be over 2800 degrees Fahrenheit, and jet fuel burns at 1000 degrees cooler than that. What can account for this? Professor Stephen Jones, a physics professor at BYU, points out that thermite combustion is a process used in controlled demolitions, which produces high-temperature molten metal. In his paper, Why Indeed Did the WTC Buildings Collapse?, Jones wrote, "Molten metal was repeatedly observed and formally reported in rubble piles in the WTC Towers and WTC-7, metal that looked like molten steel or perhaps iron. I maintain that these observations are consistent with the use of high-temperature cutter charges such as thermite, HDX, or RDX, or some combination thereof, routinely used to melt, cut, and demolish steel." The idea that explosive charges were placed inside the building is supported by literally hundreds of eyewitnesses, seismic recordings, video footage, and physics. Firefighters and scores of witnesses on CNN, ABC, NBC, and CBS all talked about bombs going off that day, but once Osama bin Laden had been blamed, it was never again addressed by the mainstream media or the Keane Commission. Teresa Valise, for one, was working on the 47th floor of the North Tower when Flight 11 hit. She was quoted saying, "There were explosions going off everywhere. I was convinced that there were bombs planted all over the place, and someone was sitting at a control panel pushing detonator buttons. There was another explosion, and another. I didn't know where to run." Live on ABC, as one of the towers came down, Peter Jennings commented, "Anybody who has ever watched a building being demolished on purpose knows that if you are going to do this, you have to get at the under-infrastructure of a building and bring it down." After Building 7 came down, Dan Rather, live on CBS News, said, "For the 3rd time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down." One of the firefighters up in the 2nd tower, Louis Caccioli, told People Weekly that, "I was taking firefighters up in the elevator to the 24th floor to get in position to evacuate workers. On the last trip up, a bomb went off. We think there were bombs set in the building." William Rodriguez, a janitor in Sublevel 1 of the World Trade Center, testified to bombs exploding in the basement several seconds before the planes even hit the buildings. His testimony was completely ignored by the 9/11 Commission report. Also, seismographic data from a nearby observatory showed 2 spikes of 2.1 and 2.3 Richter at the instant the collapses began. This too indicates explosive charges, because if the towers simply pancaked down, the seismographic spikes would happen when the massive debris hit the ground, not at the start of the collapse. In all, the number of people claiming to see, hear, detect, or suspect bombs in the buildings is staggering. Add to this the visual evidence from footage of the collapse, in which demolitions experts have pointed out squibs characteristic of controlled implosions. Squibs are charges that go off early, below the line of detonation, as the buildings are coming down. If you play the Twin Towers collapses in slow motion, you will notice dozens of squibs blowing out the sides ahead of time. Another massive piece of evidence omitted from all mention by the Keane Commission was the 3rd building that collapsed on 9/11, World Trade Center 7. This 47-story building housed offices of the CIA, DoD, IRS, and the Secret Service, as well as Rudy Giuliani's emergency bunker, and a large SEC database of over 3,000 files on pending Wall Street investigations. At 5:20 p.m., Building 7 symmetrically collapsed into its own footprint in 6 seconds flat. This building was not hit by a plane, suffered only minor structural damage, and had isolated fires on a few floors. Also, demolitions experts have identified Building 7's characteristic kink just before it was brought down. A kink is where the building begins to fold inwards after the central support beams are blown. Standard procedure for implosions, they pull the middle infrastructure first, and let the floors fold into one another, instead of dangerously blowing debris outward. Added to this, in September 2002, World Trade Center complex owner Larry Silverstein accidentally admitted in an interview, "I remember getting a call from the fire department commander, telling me they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. I said, 'We've had such a terrible loss of life, maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it.' And they made that decision to pull, and we watched the building collapse." Since letting this slip in the interview, Silverstein has tried to explain away his statement, saying he meant pull the firefighters out, not pull the building down. But the fact of the matter is he said pull it, a common demolitions term, not pull them out, referring to firefighters. Later on in the same documentary, preceding the controlled demolition of World Trade Center Building 6, a cleanup worker even says, "We're getting ready to pull Building 6. It's typical jargon when imploding a building. In another interesting twist, the British BBC News actually reported on the collapse of Building 7 at 4:57 p.m., 23 minutes before it happened. As the journalist is talking about Building 7's demise, it can be seen still standing over her left shoulder. CNN also had a similar report an hour before World Trade Center 7 came down, saying, quote, "We are getting information now that one of the other buildings, Building 7, has either collapsed or is collapsing." Anyone else curious where CNN and the BBC are getting their information? A few miles away in Arlington, Virginia, the official story states that American Airlines Flight 77 was hijacked and crashed into the side of the Pentagon at 9:38 a.m. In the minutes preceding, the plane allegedly performed a highly technical 330-degree banking turn, descending 7,000 feet in 3 minutes at over 500 miles per hour. Many pilots have gone on the record stating that this is absolutely impossible, like commercial and Air Force pilot Russ Wittenberg, who told Wing TV, "Flight 77 could not possibly have flown at those speeds which they say it did, without going into high-speed stall. The airplane won't go that fast when you start pulling those high-G maneuvers. That plane would have fallen out of the sky." Assuming a hijacker really did pull off this impossible maneuver, by doing so, he stupidly took the plane away from important sections housing the Joint Chiefs and Donald Rumsfeld's office to a recently renovated, unimportant part of the Pentagon. As news teams arrived on the scene, early footage of the Pentagon shows no skid marks on the lawn, no bodies, no blood, no significant pieces of wreckage, just a small, smoldering 20-foot hole in the wall. After reports of secondary explosions and the roof collapsing, the hole widened marginally, but even then remained far too small to account for a 155-foot long, 44-foot high, 124-foot wide, 100-ton Boeing 757. Small plane scraps were found inside and on the lawn, but most were small enough to be carried off by hand. There were no titanium engines, no indestructible landing gear, no major wing pieces, fuselage, or tail sections anywhere to be found. There were no bodies or blood anywhere either. Yet supposedly, forensic specialists were able to positively identify 184 of the 187 passengers through DNA work. 80 CCTV cameras were watching the point of impact at the Pentagon, including security cameras at the nearby hotel and gas station, but employees said FBI agents came within minutes to confiscate their tapes. All 80 tapes have been withheld from public view for national security reasons, save 5 frames they released that show the explosion, but no plane. The official story states that the 4th plane, Flight 93, went down in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, after a passenger revolt on board. Witnesses in Shanksville estimated the hole was about 20 feet long by 15 feet wide. They said on Fox News there was really no smoke, no fire, no airplane wreckage, no titanium engines, indestructible landing gear, body, wing, tail sections, and again, no blood or bodies. Wally Miller, the Somerset County coroner on the scene, said, "It looked like somebody just dropped a bunch of metal out of the sky, like someone took a scrap truck, dug a 10-foot ditch, and dumped trash into it. I stopped being a coroner after about 20 minutes, because there were no bodies there." This was the second time in history that a commercial plane full of passengers crashed and obliterated into nothingness, all wreckage and bodies disappearing. The first time was earlier that morning at the Pentagon. The official government excuse for allowing the attacks to take place was ignorance. National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice said, "I don't think anybody could have predicted that these people would take an airplane and slam it into the World Trade Center." President Bush said his first reaction upon seeing a plane hit the tower was, "That's some bad pilot." Bush was busy with an elementary school photo op that morning. Even when his advisor told him of the second plane hitting the towers, he sat reading My Pet Goat for another 8 minutes. David Icke wrote, "The president reportedly told the school's principal that a commercial plane has hit the World Trade Center and we're going to go ahead and do the reading thing anyway." Critics find this incredible. If the hijackings were unanticipated occurrences, as claimed, with one of the hijacked airplanes having already completed its terrorist mission, the country was suffering the worst terrorist attack of its history. And yet the commander-in-chief, rather than making sure that his military was prepared to shoot down all hijacked planes, sticks to his planned schedule. This photo opportunity involved, as indicated above, the president's listening to second graders read a book about a pet goat. After Bush had been in the classroom a few minutes, his chief of staff, Andrew Card, came in and whispered in his ear, reportedly telling him about the second attack. But the president, after a brief pause, had the children go ahead with the reading demonstration. Is it possible that Bush, Rice, Rumsfeld, and friends truly were ignorant of the impending 9/11 attacks? Take a look at this timeline of events leading up to 9/11 and decide for yourself. To begin with, most people are unaware that the Bush and bin Laden families have been close friends and colleagues for a long time. Back in 1976, Osama's older brother, Salim bin Laden, invested $50,000 in George W. Bush's budding Arbusto Energy Company. They met through fellow CIA employee and Bush family friend Jim Bath, who handled all the bin Laden family's American investments. By the late 1970s, the Bushes and bin Ladens already owned oil companies and airports together. Larry Klayman, president of Judicial Watch, among others, has confirmed that the Bush family also vacations with the bin Ladens and usually stays at their home when they are in Saudi Arabia. How many know that the Bush family and the bin Laden family have long been extremely close? Or that the former head of the family construction business, Salim bin Laden, brother of Osama, was an investor in President Bush's first oil company? Or that an investor in a later Bush company was Khalid bin Mahfouz, an associate of bin Laden, who was named by the U.S. State Department during the Clinton administration as a funder of the al-Qaeda terrorist network? Or that al-Qaeda was funded into existence by the CIA during the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan? Or that the al-Qaeda tunnel systems in Afghanistan were built by bin Laden construction with CIA money, funneled through Pakistan Military Intelligence, the ISI, which is the CIA branch in Pakistan. Since the late 1980s, the Bushes and bin Ladens have also worked together in the Carlyle Group, Washington, D.C.'s largest private equity firm, which deals in the industries of aerospace, defense, automotive, consumer, retail, energy, power, healthcare, real estate, technology, telecommunications, media, and transportation. In 1998 and 2000, George Bush Sr. traveled to Saudi Arabia on behalf of the Carlyle Group and met with the bin Laden family. Then, on the morning of September 11th, as the planes were heading for the towers, George Bush Sr. actually sat in the Washington Ritz-Carlton Hotel at a Carlyle Group meeting with Osama's brother, Shafiq bin Laden. The London Observer reported on this June 22, 2002. Quote, "On 11th of September, while al-Qaeda planes slammed into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, the Carlyle Group hosted a conference at a Washington hotel. Among the guests of honor was a valued investor, Shafiq bin Laden, brother to Osama." The Wall Street Journal later called for Bush Sr. to resign from Carlyle Group. He never did, but for fear of bad publicity, the bin Laden family formally sold their investments back to the firm in October 2001. They went on national TV calling Osama the black sheep of the family, effectively disowned and washed their hands of responsibility for him. Nowadays, bin Laden Construction still builds most United States military bases in the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia, including the bases in Iraq. The Carlyle Group also has very close links with the bin Laden family, who have been both clients and investors. Father Bush has been a paid consultant to the bin Laden Group. Reports in the Wall Street Journal say these Carlyle investments have been earning the bin Laden family some 40% a year on their money since 1995. The Carlyle Group is the biggest defense contractor on Earth, and the majority owners are the Bush family and the bin Laden family. Both families are profiting hundreds of billions of dollars off America's foreign policy, and Carlyle's earnings continue to rise since 9/11. Osama bin Laden was the 17th of 52 sons of construction baron Mohammed bin Laden. Back in 1979, the CIA paid Osama to recruit and train al-Qaeda fighters. When Bush became CIA director in the 1980s, they recruited Osama, al-Qaeda, and the Taliban in Afghanistan to run their opium trade. Everything changed, however, on December 4, 1997, when American oil barons proposed the Afghanistan oil line to the Taliban, who turned it down after demanding too large a share. A BBC headline from that day read, "Representatives of the Taliban are in Texas, visiting the headquarters of Unocoal." The proposed pipeline was to be built by Halliburton, whose CEO at the time was none other than Dick Cheney. Shortly after this, the media began labeling the Taliban as terrorists. In 1999, NORAD performed exercises in which hijacked airliners were used as weapons to crash into targets, one of them being the World Trade Center. A USA Today article from March 18, 2004 read, "In the 2 years before the September 11th attacks, the North American Aerospace Defense Command conducted exercises simulating what the White House says was unimaginable at the time: hijacked airliners used as weapons to crash into targets and cause mass casualties. One of the imagined targets was the World Trade Center." In September of 2000, Rebuilding America's Defenses was published by Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, Jeb Bush, and others from the Project for a New American Century team. In it, they said regarding their plans for the Middle East that, quote, "The process of transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor." On October 24, 2000, MASCAL was a Pentagon training exercise that simulated a Boeing 757 crashing into the building. Back in 1989, Charles Burlingame, an ex-Navy F-4 pilot who worked at the Pentagon for 17 years, also participated in an earlier version of MASCAL, crashing simulated planes into the Pentagon. Burlingame retired from the Navy into a job at American Airlines. 12 years later, on 9/11, it was none other than Charles Burlingame's Boeing 757 American Airlines Flight 77 that was supposedly hijacked and crashed into the Pentagon. In January 2001, FBI Deputy Director John O'Neill went public that the Bush administration and Clinton's had ordered the FBI to back off investigations of bin Laden and al-Qaeda. Alex Jones wrote, "The next piece of evidence you are about to read is the biggest smoking gun of all. President George W. Bush signed Secret National Security Order number W199I, telling FBI agents, as well as defense intelligence officers, that if they tried to stop al-Qaeda, they would be arrested under national security implications. This secret, leaked document has been in many publications, including BBC News Online, Agency France Presse, and the London Guardian. Lawsuits have now been filed by FBI agents who were outraged by the fact that they were not allowed to stop al-Qaeda. The worldwide crime syndicate that George W. Bush and his family work for has everything to gain from the September 11th attacks: a national ID card, a national control grid, and a cashless society. It's part of the public record. George W. Bush signed the documents threatening defense intelligence and FBI agents with arrest if they stopped al-Qaeda. This is the most absolutely treasonous, treacherous thing he could possibly do." FBI Director John O'Neill was so furious that he quit after the Bush administration blocked his investigation of Osama bin Laden. He was then generously offered a position in the private sector working as Kroll head of security. Marvin Bush was director of Securicom and Kroll, which provided electronic security for the World Trade Center, United Airlines, and Dulles Airport, all three of which were involved in the 9/11 attacks. The head of security position offered to Mr. O'Neill was for the World Trade Center. His first week on the job was the week of September 11th, 2001. CNN's American Morning with Paula Zahn reported that FBI Deputy Director John O'Neill resigned because he felt the U.S. administration was obstructing the FBI in their attempts to stop al-Qaeda. The show went on to report that Bush signed W-199I, restricting the investigation. Again, this is high treason and absolute fact. George W. Bush signed this publicly reported document. The BBC has a copy of it. The body of evidence is conclusive. George W. Bush is an intimate partner with bin Laden and a traitor to America. We have already talked about FBI Deputy Director John O'Neill quitting because George Bush signed the order forbidding him to stop al-Qaeda. The reason for his not going public now? Mr. O'Neill is dead. His new job was head of security for the World Trade Center complex, and he died in the collapse of September 11th, his first day on the job. Back in 1996 and 1998, the Sudanese twice tried to arrest bin Laden, but Clinton also ordered his release. This was reported in the Los Angeles Times, the London Times, WorldNet Daily, the Village Voice, and other mainstream sources. The truth is that the Central Intelligence Agency, controlled by Wall Street, has been grooming bin Laden and his family over the last 50 years to carry out dangerous projects in the Middle East, Central Asia, and North Africa. Back in 1996, according to the Times of India, the CIA worked in tandem with Pakistan to create the Taliban. Then, in 1998, when the Afghans offered to arrest bin Laden, the CIA responded by publicly telling them to do no such thing. They needed this boogeyman for one more big action. Through all of this, bin Laden's family was being rewarded with giant satellite company deals, oil company mergers, and some of the biggest construction projects in the world. In May 2001, the Bush administration gave $43 million in aid to the Taliban. In June, German intelligence, the BND, warned the CIA that, quote, Middle Eastern terrorists are planning to hijack commercial airlines to use as weapons to attack America. In July, George J. Tenet, director of the CIA, warned Condoleezza Rice, National Security Advisor, of the imminent al-Qaeda attack, but failed to persuade her to take action. On July 4th, 2001, Osama bin Laden, wanted since 1999, was on dialysis at an American hospital in Dubai, where he was visited by the local chief of the CIA. Alex Jones wrote, Shortly after September 11th, witnesses came forward documenting for the record the fact that bin Laden met with the CIA section chief for 10 days in Dubai in the American hospital. French intelligence was so upset by what they had learned that they purposely published media reports prior to September 11th, specifically warning that bin Laden was planning to hijack aircraft and fly them into tall buildings in downtown Manhattan as well as the Pentagon. On July 24th, World Trade Center owner Larry Silverstein took out a $3.5 billion insurance policy on the entire complex, which specifically covered acts of terrorism. On August 6th, President Bush's own daily debriefing memo was headed, Bin Laden determined to attack within the United States. Also, in August, the FBI arrested a Muslim militant linked to bin Laden in Boston. French intelligence confirmed the connection, and the FBI learned he had been taking flying lessons and possessed Boeing aircraft and flight training manuals. Later, in August, Russian President Vladimir Putin himself ordered Russian intelligence to warn the U.S. government of imminent attacks on airports and government buildings. Putin later stated, I ordered my intelligence to warn President Bush in the strongest terms that 25 terrorists were getting ready to attack the U.S., including important government buildings like the Pentagon. The head of Russian intelligence said himself, We had clearly warned them, the U.S., on several occasions. Israel's Mossad intelligence agency also met with the CIA in August regarding the proposed 9/11 attacks. Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak says that he gave the United States specific warnings that something big was going to happen in New York 12 days prior to September 11th. In an interview in December of 2001, he stated, We expected that something was going to happen and informed the Americans. We told them. Other warnings were ignored from Russia, Israel, Germany, and France. On September 14, 2001, Ananova News Service reported that German police confirmed that an Iranian deportee phoned warnings to U.S. police agencies including the Secret Service, about the impending attack on the World Trade Center. A month before the attacks, Israeli intelligence warned U.S. intelligence of al-Qaeda plans to attack highly visible targets like the Pentagon, World Trade Center, White House, and CIA headquarters. Dr. Tatanya Koragina, a leading Russian economist in Vladimir Putin's inner circle, in an interview with Pravda on July 12, 2001, stated that America was a giant financial iceberg and that a private $300 trillion group working towards world government was going to launch an attack on the U.S. financial system. During this interview, she also stated that the attack would come in the next few months. An anonymous listener to a Cayman Islands radio station wrote a letter 2 weeks before the attack, which was passed on to a Cayman government official. The letter stated that agents of Osama bin Laden had entered the U.S. and were about to carry out an attack via an airline or airlines. Just a week before 9/11, World Trade Center occupants Zim Israeli Shipping Company suspiciously broke their lease, packed up, and moved out after paying a $50,000 penalty for breaking their contract. Then, on September 6th, there were 4 times the normal amount of put options, bets to go down, placed on United Airlines stock. The next day, more than 5 times the usual put volume was placed on Boeing stock. And on September 10th, American Airlines had nearly 11 times its daily put average. No other airlines showed such anomalies. CIA Executive Director Buzzy Krongard was implicated along with a few other CIA-related investment firms as being the one who placed the UA put options, but as of yet, no further investigations have been made. Newsweek twice reported that top Pentagon officials had got a warning of the impending attack on September 10th and cancelled their flights for that day. This confirms that these officials knew both the locations of the imminent attack and the method of using jetliners as bombs. Not only did a group of top Pentagon officials cancel their 9/11 flights, Mayor Willie Brown, author Salman Rushdie, and Attorney General John Ashcroft all said they were specifically warned not to fly. None of them will divulge sources, but Brown said he was warned by an unspecified federal agency. Rushdie was temporarily banned by the FAA, and Ashcroft cited an FBI threat assessment saying he had been advised to travel only by private jet for the remainder of his term. During a CBS interview with Dan Rather, Tom Kennedy, a spokesman for FEMA's National Urban Search and Rescue Team, let it slip that they were sent out to New York City on September 10th. Tom Kennedy said to Dan Rather, "We're currently one of the first teams that was deployed to support the city of New York in this disaster. We arrived on late Monday night and went right into action on Tuesday morning." Paul Joseph Watson wrote, "The National Security Agency intercepted 2 messages on September 10th, indicating a significant event was to take place the next day. The messages were in Arabic and stated, 'Tomorrow is 0 hour,' and 'The match begins tomorrow.' The majority of communication took place between Khalid Sheikh, one of the chief 9/11 planners, and Mohammed Atta, the lead hijacker. NSA intercepts also detected multiple phone calls from Abu Zabida, bin Laden's chief of operations, to the United States. Over 30 messages in all had been received by the NSA from May to September, indicating an imminent attack." Unbelievably, with all these warnings, relationships, covert ops, and examples of foreknowledge, the Bush administration claimed and continues to claim complete ignorance regarding the 9/11 attacks. On that very morning, once again, NORAD and the FAA were running suspicious drills. Operation Vigilant Guardian and Northern Vigilance moved New York and DC fighter planes hundreds of miles away where they performed training exercises involving hijacked planes. British MP and Blair cabinet minister Michael Meacher in the London Guardian said, "The first hijacking was suspected at not later than 8:20 a.m., and the last hijacked aircraft crashed in Pennsylvania at 10:06 a.m. Not a single fighter plane was scrambled to investigate from the U.S. Andrews Air Force Base, just 10 miles from Washington, D.C., until after the 3rd plane had hit the Pentagon at 9:38 a.m. Why not? The FAA and NORAD essentially stood down that morning. Any other day, when planes go off course, fast movers are scrambled within 10 minutes to liaison. That is standard procedure and had already happened 67 times in 2001 alone. why was 9/11 any different? When giving evidence to the 9/11 Congressional Commission, Secretary of Transportation Norman Mineta stated that Dick Cheney knew of the plane heading for the Pentagon but purposely ordered the stand down. Quote, "There was a young man who had come in and said to the Vice President, 'The plane is 50 miles out. The plane is 30 miles out.' And when it got down to 'the plane is 10 miles out,' the young man also said to the Vice President, 'Do the orders still stand?' And the Vice President turned and whipped his neck around and said, 'Of course the orders still stand. Have you heard anything to the contrary?' Well, at the time, I didn't know what that all meant." Norman Mineta's testimony was completely ignored by the Keene Commission report. Former White House counterterrorism expert Richard Clarke told Vanity Fair that on the days following 9/11, when all commercial flights were down, the Bush administration allowed at least 4 private flights with about 140 Saudis, including over 20 members of the bin Laden family, to escape the U.S. without being interviewed or interrogated by the FBI. Not long after, it came out many of the supposed hijackers were or are still alive. Paul Joseph Watson wrote, "As is now well known, at least 8 of the September 11th suicide hijackers either died before the event or are actually still alive. This isn't some kind of internet conspiracy theory. It's been reported in mainstream media across the world. Furthermore, 4 of the 5 named Flight 11 hijackers are still alive and could not have been on the plane that hit the North Tower. Beside the fact that according to their flight school instructors, they could barely fly a Cessna, never mind a Boeing 767. It has been confirmed that 7 of the alleged hijackers are still alive and well. Another one had died already in 2000. The Bush administration and Keene report have nothing to say on this matter. On top of this, September 15th, 2001, it came out in Newsweek that 5 of the alleged hijackers may have trained at U.S. bases. Shortly after, the Pensacola News Journal confirmed that 3 of the hijackers were trained at the Pensacola NAS in 1999. In the following months, it got out that the CIA had been tracking 2 of the hijackers for 4 years, and had actually helped getting visas for all 19. Alex Jones wrote, "It emerged in May of 2002 that the Central Intelligence Agency had officers and assets shadowing 2 of the hijackers. Newsweek ran the headline, 'The Hijackers We Let Escape,' reporting the fact that the CIA followed these 2 men into Malaysia, where they had a meeting with senior leaders of the Al-Qaeda in 2000. The CIA flew out of Los Angeles, closely tracking Al-Qaeda Pakistani intelligence useful idiots Nawaf al-Zami and Khalid al-Madar. Both men attended what the FBI called an Al-Qaeda summit. The American people were shocked to learn that the CIA had been following the hijackers for 4 years. Even after their meeting in 2000 with the leadership of the Al-Qaeda, al-Hazmi and al-Madar were allowed to return to the United States to enroll in flight schools. Reports in the BBC and Washington Times confirmed that the CIA had pressured U.S. embassies abroad and the INS to issue visas for all 19 of the hijackers. The government claims that the lead hijacker, Mohammed Atta's suitcase, was accidentally not loaded onto the flight that day. Inside it, investigators say they found the Quran, a video on how to fly commercial planes, and a fuel consumption indicator. The night before, he also accidentally left a Quran in a Florida strip club. Then another Quran and an Arabic flight manual were found in his rental car. Why didn't he take a taxi? If he was such an Islamic extremist, and about to take his life for his religion, why was he at a strip club? And why did he bring his Quran inside? It also came out that Mohammed Atta was wired $100,000 by the CIA through the ISI. One of the biggest smoking guns to indicate that the terrorist attack was an inside job is the CIA's direct connection with the hijackers via Pakistan ISI Director General Mahmoud Ahmad. General Mahmoud Ahmad instructed Ahmad Umar Sheikh to hotwire $100,000 to the 9/11 lead hijacker, Mohammed Atta. On September 11th, Ahmed was a guest of former clandestine CIA officer and CFR member Porter Goss and Skull and Bones CFR member Senator Bob Graham. Since September 4th, he had met with top brass at the CIA, the Pentagon, and the White House, including Colin Powell, Richard Armitage, Joe Biden, and George Tenet. In a statement issued to Al Jazeera just days after the 9/11 attacks, Osama bin Laden said, "The US government has consistently blamed me for being behind every attack. I would like to assure the world that I did not plan the recent attacks, which seem to have been planned by people for personal reasons." Weeks later, Japanese, Chinese, and Indian news reports all confirmed Osama's death. But then, on December 14, 2001, the US government came out with the Bin Laden confession tapes, starring someone whom we are told is Osama bin Laden, yet looks and acts nothing like him. His beard changes color, his skin darkens, and his face fattens. He's actually seen signing a paper with his right hand, even though Osama bin Laden is left-handed. He claims responsibility for the 9/11 attacks and said he did so because he hates our freedom. This fake Osama is still alive and well, hiding in the caves of sheeple's minds worldwide. Now President Bush is seeking to restrict Capitol Hill probes. He had Dick Cheney call 6 separate congressional committees and threaten them, telling them not to investigate September 11th. It took 9 days until an investigation was ordered into Pearl Harbor. It took 7 days until an investigation was ordered into JFK's assassination. It took 7 days until an investigation was ordered into the Challenger. It took 6 days until an investigation was ordered into the Titanic. It took 411 days until an investigation was ordered into 9/11. $75 million was allocated for the 1986 Challenger investigation. $50 million was allocated for the 2004 Columbia investigation. $40 million was allocated for the Clinton-Lewinsky investigation. Only $14 million was allocated for the 9/11 Commission. Is this the kind of effort shown by a government in support of a thorough investigation into these attacks? Once the government finally agreed to an investigation, Bush originally appointed war criminal Henry Kissinger, of all people, to lead the commission. This alone should have been a red flag as to how investigative the commission whitewash would be. Kissinger quickly stepped down due to public pressure, and CFR member Thomas Keane took his place. In June 2002, Lieutenant Colonel Steve Butler, the dean of the Defense Language School in Monterey, California, claiming he was forced to train lead hijacker Mohammed Atta, wrote a letter to the editor of the Monterey Herald. He also wrote regarding Bush's prior knowledge and motive for the attack, stating, "Of course Bush knew about the impending attacks on America. He did nothing to warn the American people, because he needed this war on terrorism. His daddy had Saddam, and he needed Osama." He said that the 9/11 events were engineered to work the American people into a frenzy, which would in turn allow the Bush administration to further its political goals. After making that statement, he was suspended from duty, and motions were made to court-martial him under Article 88. Alex Jones wrote, "Why would the globalists in control of our intelligence community orchestrate such terror? Right after the attacks, Bush's approval rating went from 45% to 90+%. The USA Patriot Act, which effectively eviscerated the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, was passed, radically expanding the scope of the already colossal police-state complex. Their cashless society, compact city control grid is accelerating into place as Americans scramble for security." And David Icke wrote, "Indeed, it almost seems to be a requirement or admission into public discourse to announce that one rejects conspiracy theories. What is the logic behind this thinking? It cannot be that we literally reject the very idea that conspiracies occur. We all accept conspiracy theories of all sorts. We accept a conspiracy theory whenever we believe that 2 or more people have conspired in secret to achieve some goal, such as to rob a bank, defraud customers, or fix prices. It is false to suggest that those who allege that the attacks occurred because of official complicity are conspiracy theorists, while those who accept the official account are not. People differ on this issue merely in terms of which conspiracy theory they hold to be true, or at least most probable. According to the official account, the attacks of 9/11 occurred because of a conspiracy among Muslims, with Osama bin Laden being the chief conspirator. Revisionists reject that theory, at least as a sufficient account of what happened, maintaining that the attacks cannot be satisfactorily explained without postulating conspiracy by officials of the U.S. government, at least in allowing the attacks to succeed. The choice is, accordingly, simply between some version of the received conspiracy theory and some version of the revisionist conspiracy theory.